that there was a complicated mosaic in Kilts's article, the Gab article, and that it included these various elements from Queen Elizabeth to the Coca-Cola, which the vending machine is like we buy Cokes out of them, right? That we're buying sodas and everything else. That you had some very interesting things about race in the United States because of Rachel Dolezal and what kind of claim she's making about what it means to be black or white. And you're mentioning the Greeks, and we're bringing in sort of where does in fact ethnicity come from? What do we mean by that when we're talking about it? The Ethiopian eunuch, the icons and memes, and that in your understanding, and I mean we've been working for some months, some years now, you and me trying to unpack some of this, and now we're trying to express it outside of our conversation. But yes. For you, it's all started. I think it's really helpful for people to hear it, because when you wrote it for Gab, you were writing it for the American audience, and in the conversation that we've been in about what's nationalism, what's ethnicity. Weirdly enough, most Americans, I think, will assume that the Australian story is basically the same as ours, only a little bit delayed. Yes. And you're saying it's not. It's in fact different, and the contrast is what helps you see certain things in American culture, I don't know, more vividly than you were saying we seem to be able to from your observing of us.
I think outsiders have the benefit of that kind of perspective, because we're not myopic. I don't have prejudices when I'm looking at the American situation, because I don't have to deal with the emotions that are behind it. So I can study it in a completely different way. Mm-hmm. And also, because I haven't been integrated into white culture, I don't have the same view of myself that people in America would have if they looked at me. So for this reason, I think it gives me the benefit of being able to do a little bit of an autopsy on the American situation, because I didn't grow up white. And I have a completely different understanding of ethnicity than most Americans do, because of where I grew up and who I grew up with. And it frees me a little bit from having to abide by your taboos. Mm-hmm. I don't feel the kind of sensitivity that a lot of people do. So, I needed to share this, because I've been in trouble from a lot of leftists here in Australia that I've known when I've said I'm a nationalist, and they'll say, "Oh, you're a fucking fascist."
Well, right? I mean, we get called fascists too,
but yeah.
It doesn't mean the same thing.
Well, I mean, I don't know, but because I don't care, because they're assuming, well, they're making an assumption then on what kind of nation I want to be a part of. And because the leftists don't have any ability to look at history the way that, you or I are looking at it, they're being indoctrinated by the Americanism. Mm-hmm. And throwing something on me that doesn't exist, because they're being indoctrinated by the American mentality, where I have not been indoctrinated by this. So if I use the word nationalism, a lot of people will instantly say, oh, okay, so she's like a white nationalist. Hilarious. Or they'll assume that the nation I'm talking about is the one that they would place me in when they first see me. But they don't realize that all I mean by that is that I'm acknowledging the nations exist. The Greeks are a nation. They arrived here. They don't want to give up being Greek. The Italians arrived here. They don't want to give up being Italian. But something happened to those people when they arrived in Australia. We've had a different kind of ethnogenesis here. And it's something that has happened here that has not happened in America. It didn't happen in America. So I wanted to talk about that with everybody, because if the Americans are having this conversation now about Christian nationalism and what that really means, and I'm staring at it from across the Pacific, I'm hearing a lot of things which are resonating, and then some things which make me want to vomit, because I think you're missing out on some opportunities to unpack what happened to the Anglo order, why it's collapsed so catastrophically.
Right.
So I tried to put a lot of that into the article, but of course my influences are so disparate. It was a very difficult thing to kind of pack into a linear blog format.
Yes, well, the thing is, I think
yeah.
hearing you talk about it now, I think we're starting to get to the place where people are going to be able to get the threads. So I mean, and now they can see you, and you say, okay, look at you from the outside, and make all sorts of assumptions about
Yeah.
your own self-identity based on your skin color and your speaking English and that you're female and stuff like that. And you I mean, that now you today. Are after your gender reveal in the live streams. And I think you need to sort of back up and say some more things about how can you not have grown up white? What does that mean in your understanding? I'm showing on screen the image of Rachel Dolezal that was in the Gab article with one of the famous pictures of Cleopatra, where she's got a leopard and a slave woman, and she's looking at some slaves who are dead, whom she's been testing medicines on. And that you make a very interesting article about Rachel Dolezal that I think would startle a lot of people, and that fits with what you're trying to make an argument about. What kind of ethnicity are we even talking about if we're going back to Greece or if we're going back to Egypt, and how Cleopatra helps you. She's a sort of meme of herself. How you can unpack some, maybe if we can understand Cleopatra, we can start unpacking some of the things that don't make sense ethnically in the present, and yet they're because they're using categories that aren't even, I mean, they're not even historical in very complicated ways. So a bit more about how can you say you're not white in an Australian context, and what that gives, what that enables you to see in the American claims.
Okay. So for the Americans that are watching this, maybe people from Europe or whatever, but non-Australians, there was something in Australia called the White Australia policy, which was enforced very strictly. And I forget the date. I think it was like 1963. They phased it out, maybe. I don't know. I'm not a historian. I don't care about the date.
You live in dream time, and I can't. I've lost all my professorial abilities tonight. I'm just here streaming.
I don't live in a chronological continent, so it doesn't, like, the date isn't relevant. And I'll explain that another time, but okay, so we had White Australia policy, and then this basically meant that only white migration was permissible in the Australian continent for the entire history of British migration to Australia. But the interesting thing about the White Australia policy is that also excluded continental Europeans from migrating here because they were considered not white. And I don't know if
continental meaning German, French,
Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Greek, all of the Balkans people, all Russia. I mean, anybody, the Finno-Ugrics, no Hungarians, no Romanians, nobody. Dutch, no.
So who counted as white?
Yeah, it's interesting. Protestants.
Protestant. Oh, not Catholics. Catholics were not white under the White Australia policy.
They had been classed, I think, as a kind of, we'll incorporate you a little bit, because we had a really interesting tension down here between the Irish Catholics and the Whig Protestants that were the ruling class of the colonial Australian experiment. The Whigs were the progressives, these are the free market. They want everything to be like how everybody kind of wants everything to go back to. And they considered Irish Catholics to be the scum of the earth. So there was an enormous amount of tension here for a very long time between the Celtic Catholic population of Australia and the Protestant Whigs. And they smoothed it out just enough to allow everybody to be, kind of comfortable, but they had absolutely no intention of letting any other Catholic populations into the Australian continent. Why that is, we can get into that another time. I've got my theories, but for everyone watching, the blonde, blue-eyed Greeks from Ionia would have been considered to be non-white under that policy. They were very much considered non-white. And when the policy dropped, the first people that they brought into the country were blonde, blue-eyed Baltics, who were still considered non-white. The government decided to bring them in because they looked just white enough that they would be able to warm up the Australians to the concept of non-white migration. So when I use the term white now, I'm using it as an Australian, and I'm not using it as an American. So this is how I can say I'm not white. And this is why I get pissed off when Americans call me white, because I'm not. Only in America. Because if I went to America and I stepped foot on US soil, I would lose my ethnic identity immediately, because you guys have a completely different understanding of ethnic groups than we do.
Well, to a certain extent, it's hard to say whether Americans have, which ethnic groups we think we know about and which ones we don't. And what I'm conscious of, sitting here in my mother's basement looking at a picture that it's a sketch that the base did, where my grandfather was stationed after World War II as one of the doctors, and there's so long dock, and it's the Herzog base near Nuremberg. The Germans don't really have an ethnicity here in the United States anymore. And if I told you my mother's maiden name, then you'd see we were German. Both my mom and my dad have German ancestry, quite recent, but no Americans talk about that. So I think in the sense of like what counts as white, what counts as not white, the erasure of our German ancestry is quite telling.
It's very interesting because they were not permitted to migrate here under that policy. So it's very difficult having conversations then on the internet for me, and I've tried to do it for the last couple of years, to provoke everybody to think about it in a different way, because you start talking about white Germans, and I find that very amusing because they were not counted as such under the colonial system here.